Hi there and welcome to Tech Talks. I'm Liz Hardie and I'm joined today by John Chu. We're both from the ICANN Technical Services team. So we are doing a series of Tech Talks covering the questions that we were asked on our end of tax year planning webinar. As there were a lot of them, we've split them into a few separate sessions, and in this one we will be covering pensions and IHT and essentially what we should consider doing between now and April 2027. So in terms of your pension pot in relation to retirement income required, if we think that a client might be living longer, if we think about our Life 100 plus research, we're looking at the 100 life. And so people would want to maybe look at their pension pot to see if they actually do need the full amount that they've got there. If they don't, then they can be split into what they actually need, what they think they might need, and what they definitely don't need. And so if there's a large surplus that won't be needed, then maybe we can look at the income tax situation with taking the money out, think about tax-free cash, and potentially the client's tax rate versus those who might inherit the pension as well. And if you're also thinking about pre and post age 75 deaths. So, John, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one when obviously we're interacting with the good sales and the kind of classic questions are coming around. The probably the one that's the most hot that we'll talk about in this particular podcast is around what do we do with things like tax-free cash. And you can kind of understand the motivation, not only from perhaps client's perspective, because as with all things, when there's discussion around allowances and restrictions around there, people start to think about the concept of, is my tax-free cash going to disappear? Is it going to be restricted? And so on and so forth. So you get a lot of kind of client concern around this area. But of course, it also important that we plan early for clients. As this, you've already mentioned the concept that clients are going to be living longer, and therefore, passing that wealth either to the next generation or perhaps putting it in a format that they can utilize at some point is really, really important to them, and maybe later life planning, etc. So tax-free cash, management of cash is quite important, because if we look at the pension pot being hit by, say, 40%, that is a significant fall in the value that somebody can benefit from. So we've done some work around what I would call a traditional approach to planning. This is where somebody might think about taking tax-free cash and living off that income stream, or perhaps maybe investing it in other particular areas. And so when you start to look at the numbers and you start to look at the now potential impact from April 27 moving forward, then of course a great big hit at 40% on a fund has a significant fall for value. So let me put it into another way. If I was looking to enjoy the income of my tax-free cash, but of course the first point is it's tax-free. So from an income tax perspective, it's very attractive. Guess what? I withdraw some money from my pension pot. Maybe I'm doing phased tax-free cash, for example, and I'm not suffering any income tax. But of course, that's only part of the equation, because the other part of the equation is what's the impact on inheritance tax. So we've done some numbers, and again, if you'd like more details on that, do speak to your account manager or contact us through the ICANN technical desk, where we looked at £200,000 being withdrawn and considered, well, if we could withdraw just the growth, what would happen in relation to both income tax or taxation in general, say CGT or variations, or perhaps IHT as well. And the problem is if you are living off the growth, then the problem is that your IHT will always be there because your system, your value hasn't reduced. An example where you might have, say, £800,000 as a pot, £200,000 of that would be tax-free cash. And therefore, £200,000, if you are living off the income and the growth equals the income, then of course £200,000 is always going to be subject to 40%, as well as the remaining pot. So that's about £80,000 in potential IHT just on tax-free cash alone. So what can I do with the tax-free cash? And this is the question that's coming across the desk quite often. So let's just tackle the tax-free cash one. So what's my options? Well, I could leave it in the pension. Well, the problem with that is I know that whilst I'm living off the income and the income tax is great, the IHT problem is still remaining. So the other option is perhaps let's take all the tax-free cash out. But what do we do with that? So the first option, this is probably quite common for clients that won't be advised, for example, they might go and stick it into a bank account.
Yeah.
I.e. that point of, I don't trust the government or whatever flavor of the day. It's a natural thing that clients tend to do. But if you look at that, that's probably the worst case example, because what you end up doing is moving. Okay, you haven't changed the IHT position because it's still within your estate, and you've moved it into a less tax efficient environment. You might be able to get some of the savings allowance to reduce the tax liability, but the reality is that starts to become tax, and the income after taxation can drop quite considerably. In our example here, where we might be drawing maybe 4% income off, say, tax-free cash gives us £8,000 from a pension, it's not subject to income tax. In a bank account, it would probably net down to around 6,600. So could we do that better? Yes, we could. We could put it into a collective arrangement, and I quite like that kind of concept of collective arrangement. But the challenge we have here is, of course, we've seen a reduction in CGT allowances and also on dividend side. So the effective taxation in that kind of very similar example is not the same level as it would be, say, in a bank account. It could be circa £900. You could probably reduce that down, but it's still an income tax hit. But we haven't solved the IHT problem. Now, we could do an IHT plan, so we could put those into a trust arrangement. But of course, as soon as we do that, we reduce the CGT allowance from £3,000 down to £1,500. And we've probably got a client that's using assets in other areas and maybe already mopping up those allowances. So whilst it can solve the IHT problem, it doesn't necessarily become the most tax efficient vehicle. It's certainly better than a bank account for sure. But could we do this differently? And this is where we've seen a lot of people start to think about whether a bond and a trust would work. And in fact, there's two kind of options you could look here on that kind of capital lump sum. First would be to maybe consider a flexible versionary trust. In Canada Life's perspective, that is the wealth preservation account. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. There's some great videos out there online that talks very much in the client-friendly way. Again, if you're not familiar with that, do speak to your account manager. They can let you have a copy of that or link that through. And in that particular example, the income tax liability in the first year is only £62. Now, that's not a lot of drop in available income to your client. But of course, we've started this 7-year clock. And after 7 years, that money is outside the client's estate. Now, the client still retains access to that. And in fact, if the growth is above 4%, they can also access that as well. In fact, by year 10, the income tax liability is around £500, 561 roughly. And by year 20, it's matching the same level of taxation that's generated in the collective environment, around £900. And in fact, over a 25-year lifespan, that's around £15,000 worth of income tax that could be paid. Compare that to an £80,000 saving And of course, that all sits outside the client's estate and potentially can sit outside the beneficiary's estate until they need it, i.e. when they need to bring it in. You could do a similar arrangement, for example, with DGT. And of course, the advantage with the DGT is that you would get a further discount, which you might be able to use in against other assets because of the nature of the discount. But of course, remember, in a DGT, you're setting an income level that you can't change in latter years. So again, depending upon the client's requirements in the wider planning perspective, each one of those trusts would work very well, but again, depending upon the client's circumstances. And this is a great way to start the conversation around tax-free cash. And I think this is probably one of the most topical areas we are seeing an awful lot of conversations around. Whether they should act now or perhaps post April 27, of course, is depending upon clients' circumstances. But do remember, anything that started earlier gets that 7-year clock started earlier. So it's about a balance, and that's important as part of that conversation. So kind of bring that round to where we are. I think there is a lot of kind of options around, for example, managing how we might consider exit strategy or managing pensions moving forward in a slightly different way. Hopefully that's covered that off for you, Liz.
Yeah, that was great, John. And that is definitely one of the questions that we're being asked most. Should I take my tax-free cash PCLS, and what should I do with it now? But yeah, so I suppose in terms of clients who may have like sort of expression of wishes and things like that, they might want to have a look at it at the moment as well, potentially, because if they're having their spouse benefit now, then potentially they might want to change that post sort of 2027, wouldn't they?
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you fit it right on the nail. The one thing, as with all of this, is the expression, which is really a bit like wills, should be reviewed on an annual basis to see what's appropriate. And again, if you're thinking about intergenerational planning, maybe this is the time to be having those conversations about where do you really need the money to go, and do you really need to have it? For a number of clients, yes, there's a natural passing from, say, one spouse to another spouse or civil partners, etc. But again, in some circumstances, it might be best to bypass people. And again, that planning is quite important. Remember, life cover is quite important element to all of this as well. So yeah, absolutely spot on, Liz.
Yeah. Okay, so that seems like quite a good place to round off this Tech Talks as well. So thanks for listening, and join us in the next Tech Talks. Thank you. Bye-bye.